the organizing committee for this wonderful conference here in this wonderful city. I will talk today about assessing attention and training attention mechanisms with different populations within the tracker system. But before I move on to that, I want to say special thanks to a few people. Well, first of all, Sri Chacha, Vice President of Academic Affairs of Burapha University, and Professor Chacha Kwantapani, Dean of RMCS, the College for Research Methodology Department of Science, who were nice enough to invite me to this special conference, and who came and visited me about a month ago, with two of their colleagues, Panchawadi and Makni, and Taya, I hope I pronounced this right, Kwakhin. No, I'm probably totally off. But without whom I actually literally would not be here, and I mean literally because they picked me up at the airport a few days ago, so I wouldn't be here right now. So these people have been very, very kind to me and asked me to come and give a talk to you about kinds of things that we do in the laboratory. But before I talk about the actual science, I want to present what we do and who we are to a certain extent. What is the laboratory, and what the kinds of things that we do, just to describe. So we work, as was mentioned, on perceptual cognitive functioning. We have a lot of members in the lab, so about a little over 30 members. That will fluctuate depending on how many graduate, of course, every year. And we work on issues such as human function, human performance, but we also do some biophotonics and optical imaging work that I'm not going to talk about today. And some of the populations that we sort of address this work to are for development, issues of development, so normal and abnormal development, normal and healthy aging, which is the big crux of the work that we're doing. But we also recently been working a lot with special elite performance groups, like athletes. And I will mention some of that today. So the kinds of environments that we use are, of course, we're in vision and visual perception and cognition, because they're undissociable. Vision, perception, and cognition is not dissociable, are not dissociable elements. And that's one of the points that I first am going to start trying to make, is that when you actually see, it's not just the eye that sees. The eye picks up the information, but really it's the brain that sees. Okay, and I'll give you some examples to try to convince you that that's the case. So what are some of the environments that we use? Well, because we are interested in how you process the world, how you see the world, and how you interpret the world, we have several environments where we can simulate or stimulate or replace, if you want, the real world. And some of those are immersive environments. We have two, what we call full immersion rooms. And so on the left here, you see some of the simulation. This is actually like I don't know if you know Star Trek. There was a holodeck in Star Trek. Well, these are like holodecks. Okay, so you walk in these rooms and you're surrounded by the virtual information. Okay, so you lose the real reference, and now you're in an artificial reference. And this helps us manipulate things, control things, to be able to isolate and understand what influences your behavior, and what are the elements that upon which you make your decisions. So if you'll see on the left, and just to explain the technology a bit, what you see is, and that's the old immersion room. We have now a newer one, which is all wireless. That one has wires because we're using magnetic sensors. But you see when I'm lifting the glasses and I'm bringing it down, you see the whole world distorts? And that's because when you're looking at the world, you actually see very different images. Okay? You're moving your head, images change. And they're also different from one eye to the other. Okay? So the image I see is different from the image you see, because it depends on where you are in space. Okay? And if I move my head, I actually change the image that are in my retina. Of course, the world doesn't change place, but my relative view of the world does. And to correct that and make it realistic, we capture all the movements that you make in this space, and we correct it in real time. That's why you see the space distort when I'm moving your glasses, because when you have them on, you actually change the view. And then what you see on the right, on the top there, is a car simulator, because that's one of the things that we're concerned about, is if we're going to do any kind of intervention or understand what your brain is doing, when you see things, when you interpret things, we also want to know what the consequences on real activities that you have to do in your real life. So that's the transferability notion or issue that we deal with. And of course, we have more portable versions of these kinds of environments. You see somebody on the left, on the right, on your right, on the bottom, wearing common-mounted displays. So these are displays that bring the image all the way to your eyes, okay, with special kinds of optics, so that you have a good view of the world. Can you hear me right? Ah, you have a pointer for me. Okay, very good. Going to run out of the USB slots. Okay. Okay. So these are environments. Some of the environments that we to give you an idea of what kind of environments that we're working with. I got to keep the flow here. Okay. So I'm going to show you some more. It's not responding. It's not changing. One second. Well, I don't need it. Because I can't move this thing. I'll change slides now. It's in French, that's why it's having a hard time. See, you put the key in the USB and then you got these French words popping out. So now you know how I feel when I look at everything around here. Okay? Yeah, let's just continue, but we don't need it. Okay? Okay, I'm just showing you how we manipulate the environment, but then we need some kind of measure. So how do we measure response or performance? Okay, but we have different ways of measuring response and performance. One of them is very simple. It's by asking people what they see and how they interpret things. Okay, and we use probability theory to be able to determine that when they respond about chance. Okay? And that's called the usual traditional psychophysics of human performance. But then, every once in a while, you want to know what's in the brain too. So you use other measures like functional measures like EEG or optical imaging. So we do use these kinds of methods. We also look at physiological responses. So we're interested sometimes in what the emotional that is expressed by the individual without necessarily asking the individual, but by measuring responses or electrical activity that is expressed by the body as a consequence of these emotions. So we're talking about skin conductance, heart rate, breathing rate. These are the kinds of things that we can all do in these environments to help us understand what the person is doing, perceiving, feeling, and so on and so forth. We also have eye tracking devices that you see on the top left. So it's also not just what they're looking at, but how they're gazing, how they're exploring the world that they measure. And some of the other things that we have in the lab, a little more basic, is really about how the image reaches the eye, the photons that reach the eye, and how that is all affected, the quality of the image. So we have a lot of optics and optical imaging. So we do a lot of work with photons, from the nanotechnologies all the way to how the brain absorbs different photons depending on concentrations of hemoglobin. That's called optical imaging or spectral reflectometry. So let me get back to the point. So that's a bit presentation of what the lab is and the kinds of things that we do. But one of the things that I did mention is that I wanted to convince you that vision is a brain function, not an eye function. Okay? So when you're looking at the world, like I said, you have photons that reach your eye. There's an initial phase, a photon is absorbed. Okay, so that's the camera type component of it. You've got lenses in the front, but that's it. That's the extent of it. The eye cannot interpret what it's seeing. It can only detect something. Right? And then your brain has to do the work. The first example, most obvious one that I can give you, is that in fact, you see the world in 3D, in 3 dimensions. You know that there's space, there's volume, not just in the XY dimension, but in the Z dimension. But in reality, all images that you see are 2-dimensional on your retina. Your retina does not have depth information. It just has photons on a sheet, on a background. But your brain takes that and interprets a 3rd dimension. So right off the bat, the fact that you're looking at something and you actually have a depth dimension is a brain function. But it's a lot more complex than that. First, if I look at an image, I have what's called the energy component of the image. I've been mentioning this already. Photons come in, they're detected, that's energy. So you have luminance and chromaticity. These are different characteristics of the energy that's coming into your system. That requires relatively little processing. Okay, so it's the entry level. We call that the first order level of processing an image. But then you have to take that, which is energy, and you have to determine the attributes of that energy. And what I mean by that is, we talked about stereoscopy, texture is another attribute. If you're looking at grass, and the grass is green, that's certain green, and you say this is coarse grass, this is fine grass. Well, what determined that? The mean luminance of the grass is the same, the mean chromaticity of the grass is the same. But that's texture, that's a second order property. Your brain is extracting information. And why that's important, why I'm making this point important, is because now we're crawling towards cognition, you see. Because the brain has to work to interpret what it's looking at. The brain has to work to take that information and compose it into a form or some element. You see this? Okay, good. So that's the luminance and chromaticity is the initial energy component. So we say, okay, so this is an example of energy because what I have here, even though I have a texture, you see that there's light and dark bands. Light and dark bands are energy bands here. Okay, luminance defined bands. But what I have just above that here are bands too. But the mean luminance of those bands exactly the same in all the parts of the image. Okay? So it's really how we change the grain of the texture that makes you see this. But what you don't realize is that your brain's working harder for that. It doesn't feel like it, but it is. And we use this to probe how the brain works. And we use these kinds of treatments and image statistics to understand what your brain has to do when it's doing it well, when it's developing, when it's aging, but also when it's damaged. When it's damaged from a concussion, for instance. By the way, people don't wear helmets very much here, but they should. They should. Especially the way they drive here. And that's, in fact, going to be part of the other parts of, in my discussion. But, so, how do you take this information and make it into something that makes sense? Well, you break it down into movement, stereo, I talked about that already, texture, I talked about that already, to create forms. So that's the first step. I now break down things down. I can say, that's Shoshana over there. Form, somebody sitting in a chair, and so on and so forth. And then I have to do a lot more than that, because I have to interact with the world too. So what I perceive, I now have to transfer into actions, because of course, seeing the world, perceiving the world, really the consequence of it is that we can act upon it. We can make decisions about it. Okay, that's all the very big component. And here again is the brain function. It's all about brain. And then you have issues like dynamic scenes. Well, that's even more complex because now you've got the first order elements, the second order elements that you're breaking down, then you see the world, you're breaking down to form, then movement and stereo and so on, and then you have to make sense of all that and make decisions. So think about how much of the brain is involved in all that. And that's why I've got the whole brain here. And then, if that's not enough, you've got bottom-up and top-down iterations. So what I'm seeing, I now project ideas or notions upon what I'm seeing. So even my previous experience, my expected, what I expect is going to happen will influence what I actually see. Because on the way of it going up to the brain, it's being changed by that process. So this is really a full loop, what we call bottom-up and top-down processes. So I know this is a lot of information, but it's just to illustrate that the brain works all the time, and that seeing something is not just taking pictures. Now, if you don't believe me, that even something like color is interpreted by the brain, not just by the eye. What you see here, the word color, by the way, spelled the Canadian way, look at you. That's for my American accent. So, I've got color perception, my name. Now, I think most of you would consider that the yellow here and the yellow here are the same. The blue here, or whatever color you want to call it, and the blue here are the same. So that means that the energy going to your eye, the chromaticity of it is the same. So if I took an instrument and I measured it, it would be the same. In one word, the other. But the color is interpreted by the brain. Because all I have to do is change the surrounding of the letters, and now the colors look totally different. But they're not. The chromaticity is the same. The color is different. It is different. Because your brain cannot take the color in isolation here. The surround of the color creates a kind of contrast. And that influences the color perception. So if you actually see the same color in all the words here, and the two top words versus the two bottom words, then your brain's different than mine. Okay? They are very different. Another example. If I'm going to say to you, this is just a bunch of gray, black and white dots, that would be right. But if I just temporally manipulate those black and white dots, now you start seeing something, I hope. And that something is built by your brain. Because if I just stop it, it will disappear. So that element is really built. That shape that you saw is built by a series of spatial-temporal dynamics. But the energy is always the same. That's how we isolate motion perception, by the brain. And here's another example, and I chose this example because of the color. It's very much Burapha University colors. They're purple. Oh yes, okay, that's right, RMCS, okay. So this is, it may or may not work here because it depends on the dimensions that you have, but if you start reading the words on top, you may start seeing movement that really is not there, okay? And if you see movement that's not there, well obviously nothing's moving here. This is a static image. But we had talked about this in the 90s, where we called it the peripheral drift illusion. And essentially, what it says is that if something is moving in a static image, that means you've got some kind of interpretation of what's happening. And the hypothesis that we proposed was that there was some temporal dynamics. When you look at something, you don't keep that image in your head because that would be too much. Think about how many images you put in, you take in, and you keep. Your brain would have to be humongous to be able to correlate that. So you keep constructing the images, and there are temporal dynamics because of how your eyes are moving and your head is moving and so on and so forth. So you recreate the world, and that's why you see temporal issues. Okay. So that was just my little stint to explain. Sorry, I'm going to go back. My little stint to explain that vision is a brain function. Okay. So to come back to the subject of the day, which is the neurotracker here. As was mentioned in the introduction, thank you very much for the nice introduction. We do a lot of technology transfers. We're up to actually now almost 20 different patents that we've, over the years, that we've licensed to companies. Okay. some of them in the optical domain and so on and so forth. So that's simple enough. Us as academics, we can sort of generate something, generate knowledge, and then if it's of interest, we can transfer it over, and they make a product, and that product becomes usable. But there were a series of technologies that were based on my personal interest, which is human performance and how in cognitive science. So how do you deal with that? There's no real company that deals with that. There's no real structure for it. So when I had the discussions with the University Bureau, the Transfer Bureau, I said, well, I have this number of technologies that I think could be useful, but if they were packaged sort of together, because it's all related to human performance. Okay? Human assessment, perceptual content assessment, and performance. So how can we do that? And so one of the ways to do that is to create a spin-off. Now, I'm not a businessman, so and I don't want to be necessarily. So that was all not very nice, but then we had to find a sort of a structure. So we found a way. We found some people who were used to doing this kind of thing we call spin-off. And we sort of had a coherent story, and we said, we're going to put this together, and we're going to try to build something that people can use, that can be useful for the real world. And we have 4 of these technologies, and I'm going to talk about one today. So most of them have to do with issues of assessing the quality at which how you process images and how your brain is working and so on and so forth, based on the principles that I presented before, which is that the brain has to work harder and harder for different things. And because we know that, we can actually isolate when things break down. We say, okay, your brain is broken down here as opposed to here because this is processed a little more at a complex level, this is a less complex level. And we can see if interventions change how your brain functions because we have these assessments. But one of them, the one that was the most ready, was the neurotracker. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this one here, and that's really all about behavior. So what motivated neurotracker initially? Well, if I ask you, of course this is artificial, but it looks like some of the cities in Asia. Now, if I ask you to track a few people here, more than one, well, it's going to be difficult. Okay, you say, okay, well, which one do I track? And then keep track of those. And then I realized that this happens in the real world. And the example I have here is from someplace not too far from here. Now, what I like when I look at this is how people defy all the rules of traffic control. Look at this. Now, to me, that's an amazing feat. Look at this. Talk about survival of the fittest. Look at this. And then even a pedestrian sometimes, look at these are pedestrians that walk, oh, look at that, oh. So, to me, that's absolutely amazing. So, there's a number of people here that probably die. Okay? In fact, there is a lot. Because that's the highest, that's what I was told, that this is probably in the world, one of the worst corners ever, cross-sections ever. So, are you going to see Granny, Granny for us is a grandmother, okay? So are you going to see your grandmother crossing this street? And if you do see her crossing this street, please send her to me because I want to study that. That's like a case study of somebody who's got an optimal brain to process this very, very complex information, okay? Now, this is the one thing that I was concerned about. I was watching my grandmother. They're doing fine. They were very healthy, working fine at home. When everything was predictable, when everything was within something that they were familiar with, they had no real problems with their vision. They had an aging brain, but an aging brain is not all bad. Okay, there's some we develop strategies, we develop knowledge. So they were doing okay. But if I put them on a corner of a busy street, they would freeze. And they say, oh, they can't see it. No, they can see it. The problem is they can't interpret it. And that's the cognition part. See, your brain has to work very, very hard to look at the movement, to make sense of the movement, and to make the right decisions. It's not an easy task. So, the question was, can I assess that? Can I isolate the fundamental properties that are required to do this task? And then can I improve it? And if I improve it, can I test whether it transfers to real life or not? That's everything that we do now with what we call the mirror tracker. So the first point, what is required? Now you saw some of the environments that we work with. We had the advantage and the luck and the generosity of the Canadian government who've been funding my lab quite a bit. To build these environments and control, start from all the information and break it down to the fundamental parts of information. That's very hard to do unless you have that kind of luxury. So we were able to do this to start with very large fields and say, well, what is the minimum that's necessary to really assess what people are doing? Okay, so what is required to process real-life information in dense urban environments, which relates to the talk yesterday that was given about urbanization. Urbanization is critical. It's going to happen no matter what. So the point is, how do we deal with that? How can people deal with it? How can we change the environment, but how can we change people in the environment so that they can actually process this without hurting themselves or hurting others, or being comfortable, or just being happy in these environments? So I isolated a few elements. They were based on deductions, assumptions about what was required for this, and then we've been testing it ever since. The first thing that you would think of is you need large visual field. And what we mean by visual field for us is the image that hits the retina. Okay? So if I look at the same object and it's far away, it's only a small image on my retina. Okay? When it's close, it's a large image. Well, it turns out that when you're in a crowd environment, when you're in a real environment, dynamic environment, you have to deal with a lot of that side information. Okay? The detail is only in the center, but a lot of information about the movement and the dynamics is in the side. So you need to integrate that. Turns out that in aging, that's a problem. Not because they can't detect lights. If you put a single light there, yeah, no problem. But if you put a bunch of lights and they go in one direction, you say, which direction? They say, Google, I don't know. That's what's complicated. So integration. So visual field to a certain extent is a critical component. So that's one of the components. Significant visual field. Okay? What's another component? Well, for those of you who have children, you go to the shopping center, busy, the mall, the mall. Then your two kids run, different directions. Yeah? And your wife's pulling your sleeve. So you're going to track these people. Right? And that's hard to do because they inevitably work to a certain extent independently. So one decides to go one way, the other way, so you're tracking this. Well, what happens? You saw that Hanoi intersection. That's exactly what happened, because you're not controlling what the other driver's doing, or the other one on the other side, or somebody behind you. But you have to sort of process this and make moment-by-moment decisions. That's complex. You have to do it efficiently, otherwise you're in trouble. Especially in this case, because your life depends on it. So we call that multiple in the literature. There's a certain category of manipulations called multiple object tracking. So, the elements to develop what was required to process this or assess this had to have at least some elements of multiple object tracking. So that's a second component. So now we have significant visual field, multiple object tracking. What do we have here? Speed thresholds. And that's because even if you're looking at a slow-moving crowd, there are fast movements in that slow-moving crowd. Because all of a sudden somebody bifurcates, changes direction. All of a sudden you see a hole on the street, or you see a ball bouncing in front of you. Somebody cuts you off. These are fast movements, fast transient movements, even though everybody's moving slowly. So speed is always a factor. Okay, so if you're going to measure something, you're going to have speed thresholds. So speed is critical. Okay? And also it has the added bonus here in this context of this task, to be a continuous ratio scale. For those of you who do measurements, you know that that's important. Because I have a full scale now, and I can measure this in time. It's very critical. Stereoscopy. When we talk about stereoscopy, not everybody has stereoscopy. Stereoscopy is the ability to see in 3 dimensions with both eyes. Now, it doesn't mean you can't see in 3 dimensions with only one eye. You can see, you can interpret depth. You can do it by motion paradox and so on. But both eyes is really giving you an added bonus, because in real life, you use that a lot. And in fact, if we didn't have a difference in our ability to use that, we wouldn't have left it in. But we tested it, and it really makes a big difference. So now we've broken down this fundamental properties. So this is essentially what the NeuroTracker is built on. Those fundamental properties. By taking away the context, taking away all forms of expertise. And what do I mean by expertise? Driving is an expertise. Sports is an expertise. Facial recognition is an expertise. Because this is things we do all the time. Okay? So here we've taken out the expertise, and we've got this abstract form. This is what the NeuroTracker is. It needs to be able to understand those fundamental properties. So now, in its simplest form, it's a very basic task. Though not simple to do, but basic task. So the way it works in the NeuroTracker is you've got a presentation. So we've got a number of spheres here. Now there are different versions, different things, but the basic element, the story is always basically the same. So here we have 8 spheres. We'll identify 4 of these spheres initially. So that's called the indexation phase. We index targets. We give a value to these targets for you. It means something. Those 4 targets mean something. It's called indexation. So already your brain's working when you do that. Then you have movement, okay? That's the dynamic component. We take away the index. You have to keep it in your mind. That's your index now. That sphere, that sphere, that sphere, that sphere means something more than the others. So I have to track that. That's work. The brain's working now. But then, if it's just to make it worse, we start bouncing stuff around. That's the crowd stuff, right? And that's hard because now, you know, if the spheres just stayed there, that's one thing. But now the spheres are bouncing, and there are other events, other things that are happening that are not relevant. So you have to keep yourself, what we call selective attention, active, very, very active. So that's not really easy to do. Then at the end, well, that's where the test starts. You say, okay, you have to identify which ones. There are numbers on the spheres. You say, okay, it's that one and that one. This one, that one. Bingo. You're right. What happens? It goes faster. Made a mistake. What happens? It slows down. So that way, it adapts to everybody. And so if I'm ready, and I'm training on this, my grandmother, if I'm training on this, it will slow down for her pace. It'll be hard, but at her pace. And if I'm Ronaldo, you know, a great soccer player, it will go real fast and adjust for him. But it'll be just as hard for Granny, or for him, than for Granny. So, because it adjusts to your pace, and it puts you right in that spot where there's a bit of frustration, but then the brain is working, you get reward, and that's exactly sort of how video games work to a certain extent. It's not a video game, but that principle, putting you on the edge of your comfort zone, is what makes you better. If it's above that, it's not going to help you because you can't use it. If it's too slow, it's not going to build the networks because you've done it already, you've got it. So you have to be in that zone, and that's what it does. It does it automatically. That's the way I design it. Then you get feedback. And that may look like a very small component, but that's a huge one because it's just as important. Because what we're finding now, for instance, the work we do with autism, is that the autistic children have have a harder time with this task, but some of it may be just because they can't use feedback very well. They don't learn the way we learn. The brain is different. Okay? Now there are certain things they'll do even better than us, but there's certain things they do worse. And then that's what we're trying to figure out. And sometimes it's just how they use feedback. They don't seem to use feedback very well. So these are ongoing projects with these people. So now you know what the task is. Very simple. Why don't you try it? Okay? We're going to do it in 2D. This is a non-optimal condition. And I'm just going to show you a bunch of spheres. And what I'm going to tell you to do is to look in the center, okay, at the fixation spot. Why? Well, that's because, at least initially, that's the best strategy. Okay, because if you do that, you don't track one of the elements. Because if you track one of the elements, the other 3 are moving independently. So it's going to be very difficult. So here we go. Maybe I can get a mass threshold. So, all right. So you're looking at this squat in the center, the fixation. Now 4 targets, you track these 4 targets. There we go. So this goes on for a few seconds. Everybody got it right, I'm sure. Which number are the targets? Oh, I got to give you a feedback here. What do we got? Oh, 3, 4, 5, 8. Who got it right? Bingo. So you think you're so good, eh? All right, let's try it at a different speed. Let's try it at a different speed. Let's try at this speed. I see some heads nodding. It's starting to break down. Well, you had some training, no? There's a few of you that should be excluded from the sample because you've actually trained on the system or actually been exposed to it. So, okay, and those of you who may have gotten it, I'm going to push it even further. And I'm showing you this for a reason. This is a score of 3. Yeah, you can all giggle now, it's allowed. I don't expect anybody here to do this. But the point is that for some of our professional athletes, this is easy for them. Some, at all. And after a certain amount of training, of course. And that's what we talk about. We talk about plasticity. I'm going to talk about that if I have enough time, I hope. Because I'm, as usual, when I start talking, I just go on and I don't realize what time it is. Okay, so what we have here, so I'm just going to show you the single graph. I'm not going to explain it all. All I'm going to say, and the reason is just I'm going to say that we tested the whole idea of whether stereoscopy versus non-stereoscopy makes a difference. In other words, the same image, both eyes versus one eye, different perspective. And when it comes to speed thresholds, there's a huge gain. This is a log scale, so the Y scale here, this scale here is a log scale. It's a log of a speed, so log speed. And so that means, bigger values are sort of compressed, okay? And smaller values are expanded. And what we have is a stereo versus, dichoptic. It's not really dichoptic, but a 2D image versus 3D image, okay, stereo. And you see that the threshold's higher meaning better because you can do the task at higher speeds. There's always a huge difference, highly significant difference in different conditions that we try. So I'm not going to explain all these conditions, but if you're interested, we've got all the science papers that I can send you. Okay. The work I've been here for the most part is all published already, so you can have access to the information if you want. Well, here's some of the work, like we talked about initially, aging. Okay, aging was the issue. So here's some of our first experiments in speed, and what you have here is the untrained observer, older observer. Now when I mean older observer, these are healthy older observers. These are older observers that are, between 65 and 80, but very good, healthy, no major problems. The usual aging aches and pains, but nothing worse than that. And what you find is that, okay, they do a certain speed, yes, it's slower than your young, untrained people. So these are untrained, let's say, initially. The younger observer, the older observer. But look, when you train the older observer, and this is relatively short training, so they come and they do it's about 15, 20 minutes, they do this once a week for 5 weeks. It's not that much training, okay, but still. When they do that, after that, well, they're within the range of the young, untrained, so do we make them young? No, but for that particular capacity, now they've improved their ability to process this information, so it helps them. But of course, the young ones get better too. Okay, so they can also build this expertise, this ability to process that. So we have to figure, what does this all mean? How does this transfer to real-life tasks? Well, one of the things that that just came out of the paper in the Front User of Psychology and journal. And what we're seeing here is, as a function of the weeks, we're looking at the relative improvement. So this is relative. So we take this score and we make it relative to this one relative to that one for the young, If you look as a function of the weeks, you see that's pretty well the same curve. There's no real distinction here. Here we thought maybe the older ones were actually doing better, but it turns out it's not the case. As we continue, they're pretty well the same curve. So what this tells us is that the brain, for the older observers that are healthy, are plastic for this task. They're still plastic. Of course, their vision is not the same. You know, they have presbyopia, the lens and all that, but that's not the brain part. The brain part is still plastic for this task, so you can learn this task. So this led us to, when we were doing this with the young people, we had a few, I like sports, so we had a few athletes coming in and so on. We were interested in looking at that. See, because we felt maybe they're better and they're at a ceiling, because this is something they have to do extremely well. Right? They were better, but they were not at a ceiling. They, in fact, learned the task a lot faster. So that led us to this other notions. Well, maybe that's the whole point. Maybe it's not so much where you start, it's how plastic your brain is to it. That's critical. And while we were doing this, I have to tell you a little story because I make myself look ridiculous, which is something I can do very well. And I got a phone call from a club called Manchester United Football Club. I got the phone call, and I get off the call, so it's another crank call or something, you know. And they wanted me to work with them on something. They were building a new science department, and one of the things that they wanted to develop was cognitive ability in the athletes. And there was nothing well defined in this area. It's an area that's a bit taboo. Anything going to the brain is taboo. You know, people are like, oh, there's something about how you think, maybe you're normal, abnormal. There's some taboos, especially in sports. If you work in sports, you know, that you work with a sports psychologist, not a sports psychologist, but if you work, that's, you know, usually not something. There's some resistance. There's still some of that in sports, less and less, but still some of it. Anyways, I'm getting this call, and I'm saying, I don't even know who they are. That's embarrassing, but that's the case. So I said, you know, some other group. And then I asked, of course, about some of my postdocs. Some of them come from Germany, France. And then I looked down, and I realized, oh, this is a club? This is a serious club? I said, well, yeah, it's got to be the biggest club in the world. I said, okay. In that case, I'll call back. And I did. And this was 4 or 5 years ago, okay, when we were just starting the transfer with Cognizance. And we weren't going towards sports. Our idea was to help, you know, the elderly and look at development issues and brain damage, which is still our main focus. But we said, okay, maybe there's a need there. Maybe there's something that would interest these people, and maybe we can help them after all, or at least understand what's going on. So let's start with that. And we went there, we set them up, and we worked with them, and we were stealth for a while because we weren't allowed to say that we worked with them and this kind of stuff, because they're very secretive about these things. They're worse than the military sometimes. And we did that, and we got some very, very positive experiences, and we could work all the little nicks and crannies. And now we're still with them. We're still working with them. And now we work a lot more groups than that, but these are all people that we're with right now. New England Patriots, we had a system there for almost a year and a half. The Navy SEAL Special Operations, Delta Force in the United States, for them just making better decisions under duress, under stress. For instance, we can train them, and then they're exposed to issues like, for instance, talking on the radio. You can imagine that this is something important. I'm in the field, and somebody is talking to you, messaging you on the radio. You still have to see the scene, you still have to make the right decision. So helping people make the right decision is what we work on. We've been working a lot with the NCAA groups and some combines and so on. So here's, so to talk about sports then, here's a recently published paper where now, because we were in different centers, different clubs, different countries, we can look at the generality of response in very high-level sports, professional athletes. which is amazing because if you think about it, can I get these people who make on average 10 million, between 5 to 10 million a year in my lab, 100 of them that come from across the world? I could never do that even if I wanted, right? So this gave us the opportunity to do an experiment that was worldwide with the best players in the world and the best leagues in the world. So we worked with the EPL, which is the English Premier League for soccer, and the NHL for hockey, of course. I had to have some hockey in there. I'm Canadian after all. And we had the rugby league, the European Rugby League, which is the top rugby league. Now these are all professionals, and then we can compare them with, we had 173 elite amateurs. So these are elite amateurs, all from NCAA for the most part, except maybe about 50 of them that came from Olympic training centers around the world, one of which was in Barcelona, the Spanish Olympic Training Center, where we did some work there. And we compared them with, university students, supposed to be smart, and they are. Don't get me wrong. And let's see how these brains do. And so what we have here is a number of sessions. So each session is only 5 to 6 minute bouts, okay? They're not very long sessions. And here's the sensitivity, if you will, the speed threshold, again on the log scale. I don't put numbers here because it's all relative anyways. And of course, you see that right from the start, yes, the pro athletes are much better, significantly better than the elite amateurs and the university students. But look how fast they learn. Look at this. This is amazing ability. So what probably sets them apart, and maybe the fact that they actually started at a better level, is that they have an incredible plasticity, brain plasticity, for this ability to deal with very complex dynamic scenes. Okay? Now, the NCAA and university students are no slouch. They're doing very well too. But look, they start about the same, and that would make sense. All of these groups, by the way, have exactly the same mean age and median. That was all balanced out. It's almost identical distribution. And what you see here is that they start initially, but they also learn better. So something about sports. Again, it would make sense. You don't know if it's innate, we don't know if it's trained, probably a bit of both, but there's something about this population. And then the university students. And in these university students, there's a lot of really big gamers. So we have a lot of this thing about gaming. Gaming is good. Well, I mean, there's some components of gaming that help your brain to develop, for sure. That's no issue there. But it doesn't help you all the way, because the gaming here, the incidence of gaming is higher here than these other groups, and there's no way that they're better at this. Not even close. So this is a special ability. And if you sort of normalize this, you see this is all this, again, the same thing, normalized to the initial scores. This is the key here, the growth rate. I mean, these are incredible fits. So there's no argument about the data in regards to what is happening here. They're different curves. So how their brain adapts to this particular task is quite different between the groups. Now that was an interesting finding. And it gives us a better understanding of what is required, what it does when you do this task, and how potentially it'll influence your ability to do things in real life. And we're still trying to respond to all these questions. So here's another, that in fact we published in 2012, and that's what, in fact, we sort of laid out the principles for sports training. We published that in a sports journal by the demand of people in sports, because my history was not in sports research. And most of my work was in basic journals or neurology journals or cognitive journals. And so we decided to write a paper and say, well, here are the principles. Here's why we set this up in NeuroTracker. And here's what the principles are and how it relates to athletes. But also there, the initial trials. You look at here, this is some of the groups broken down. The hockey, rugby, and soccer here, or football as they call them here. And they're very similar. The growth curve, again, even though they're very different sports, very similar. But look at this curve here. This is an NHL team, hockey team, that, in fact, that was one of the best hockey teams that year. Okay? So it's not the quality of the team. Why are they doing this? Why are they worse here? What's happening with the growth curve? Well, they were tested standing up. Just standing up. This is nothing for a hockey player. They balance, their lives is balance and control and motor control. But somehow, just standing up changed the growth function. So brain and body are not separable either. Okay? And the fact is that you're sharing some resources here, and the fact that this task is very soliciting, there's something about certain types of actions, not all, but certain types of actions, when your system is actually always online, and balance is not as natural as people think. If it was natural to just stand up, why would it take us a year to learn to walk? Right? Why would it take us 16 or 17 years to mature balance control? We've shown this in the lab, by the way. I'm not going to talk about that today. But, you know, the whole component between vision and motor and balance is not as simple as people think. You know, you're always in balance. You're always controlling your balance. Otherwise, if you just stand still and never react and never respond, you'll fall. Okay? Because inevitably little tremors and little things are going to happen. So if you don't correct online all the time, you just don't do it consciously. And in fact, so it is a form of expertise. The same way as driving is. How many of us here have made it home driving and not realize how we did it? Unfortunately. Right? Many of us have done that. Said, how did they get here? You know, because, and imagine how, now if you imagine back how hard it was when you started to drive. The first time you had to hold the steering, change the speeds, no way. You had to be conscious of everything. That's because you didn't have the expertise, you didn't have the neural structures. So expertise is there everywhere, and balance is one of those. But it's still using some network. It's still using some function, and that little function is enough to eat up your ability to learn. So this is the basic principle that we use to say why what we call, we have to train your development. In other words, you have to build and consolidate. You build especially the network, and then you add on it. You build on something that is stable. You don't learn everything at once. Otherwise, you'd be in that corner of that Hanoi intersection the first time you drove. You think that's possible? Impossible. So, we have to build on that. So, when we found this out, by pure serendipity, you know, it's typical in science, chance. We never expected that, not with athletes. But the reason we let that one team stand up is because I kept getting this from the coaches and trainers. Well, we do this, we skate, we got to do it all at once. You know, these are pros. So, okay, I broke down, and that gave us a very nice experiment, because in a way we had one group that was standing up versus the others. So the next thing I did, and this is the kind of thing we do every time we go, we start a new collaboration and partnership. So, well, what can we do a little different here to learn more about all of this? So this is all adds up. It's supposed to repeat stuff. And so this was in Barcelona, in the Spanish, training center, national training center. And they were interested in evaluating this because it turns out that Barcelona, this medical staff is the same medical staff that works with FC Barcelona. So they use their Olympic training center as a sort of a center to assess technologies and things. And so we said, okay, so if we're going to do about this whole consolidation issue, then it's important to say, well, let's first learn this task, sitting down, and then have them stand up, and then have them do something even more specific, like an exercise, and see whether we can, you know, if this is a more efficient way. So if there was no transfer, in other words, if you're standing up was almost the same, they'd be about here. You saw it in the curve before, okay? Right? But no, they do lose. Yes, it is a little more difficult, but not for long. This is only 6 sessions. So they quickly catch up and sometimes get a little boost. And then when they do the other exercise, and that exercise was, they were balancing on a Bosu ball. Now, for those of you who know sports, Bosu balls, those big balls. You stand in it, always very unstable, again, balance. And so it drains the system, and they had another ball in their hand like that, because we worked with the Olympic water polo team, male and female. And so this, we only did 14 sessions, and then we did 6 and 6. And look at what happens here. At the end of only, well, 14 plus 12, that's 26, 26 sessions, you're like in the circus act. Right? You're doing the balls, you're doing the screen, and you're doing this ball balance. And in fact, if you go back to the other score before, 26 is here. 26, they're still much worse. In fact, they're getting even worse. The difference is the gap is even worse, and they're only standing up. And now, because we did it right, 26, they're doing this balance ball with this ball in here, and they're just as good as if they were sitting down. This is the function, growth function from sitting down. So all the training programs now that we've implemented in sports are based on these science data. Okay, and you cannot start doing one combined exercise on this until you have a certain consolidation level, and then you move up and you move up. So it's all structured that way. So just to hone in this principle, and I'm going to try to move faster now because I realize I've got a lot more data. We start consolidating, we build, and we add motor loads, and this is to build the expertise from general to specific. And here's a simulated example. We have examples where we have now in the task you have using Connect, you have to intercept elements and stuff like that. But you can only do that when you have a certain consolidation level. And so we build motor loads. Now we do this in the motor domain, but we also do this in the pure cognitive domain. Okay? And this is kind of the projects we're going to be working on with Shada at the Center for Research Methods in Cognitive Science. So by doing this way, this is what the exercise that was awesome. And so now we do it with rugby players. You see here they're catching balls. And we even have this guy here, this young boy, who's skating. This is a treadmill. It's moving very, very fast at 25 miles an hour. See, he's manipulating the puck, how fast he is. He's doing speeds I can't even do. So he's really good at this. And that's because we did it in a very consolidated way. So if we move on, this is just another example of it. So what about fatigue? Now this is something, I'm actually writing this paper right now. I did this with a student of mine, Sylvain Barthez. He's actually an ex-professional rugby player, had both his knees bent the wrong way in one game. And he's finished his career, and he's switched around, and the Players Association pays for his studies, and he actually now has a PhD in neuroscience. And so we did this physical fatigue exercise. Now we decided to use pedaling. Why? Because that pedaling doesn't require balance control the same way as standing up. Okay? If you're sitting something, but you're forcing. Now these are pro athletes. They're used to getting their heart rates going very, very high. So we wanted to know whether if you were pre-trained on the NeuroTracker, for instance, you can keep your mental sharpness. You can keep doing this task, which is hard mentally, and keep it at the same level, or you would lose it by the just physical fatigue if you're untrained. Now, of course, if you're untrained and you start testing here, you're actually training them at the same time, so there's a confound there, okay? But normally, what you find here, this is really quite interesting, is that the difference is really insignificant when they're trained, so it's a very stable response. And even the gain they would get after this session, after 15 sessions, would be around here, so there's really no difference, significant difference. But here is a significant difference. And here's where they would be if the next trial was just the regular training on the exercise. Okay? So this is when they started the score, and this is when they were at 80% their maximum heart rate. So we just get them to pedal, they get their heart rate, make 80% maximum, and they do the task. Okay? We just play with the pressure of the pedal. And this is what happens. So yes, if you're not exposed to this, your mental sharpness to do this kind of task goes down. Now it turns out that this is the kind of task we do in our virtual world and environment. And it turns out that older people when the targets that people have been using in literature are very small targets, 6-degree targets, so that's like looking at somebody 60 meters away, which was really irrelevant to real life tasks. Okay, for 60 meters, you have time to change the direction, and you may change decision. It won't impact your life. But you have to make it what happens in real life is when they're 4 meters, 2 meters away. That's when you decide, because are they going left, going right? Where are they going? I have to decide when they're close. So they're bigger targets. And we said already that that's a problem with aging. So we decided to test, and you see here on this graph, young observers, young adults versus older observers. And what happens is when they're 16 meters to target, the biological motion, they're making decisions of whether they're going to walk left and right. That's all. And we're manipulating noise, there are different ways of manipulating it. But here is just a percentage. What you see is that young adults did the same. Whether it's 16 meters, 4 meters, 2 meters. Well, it starts breaking down here, but that's of course when it's so big that you're losing information. So it's pretty well a global task. But look at the older observers. Bang! They can't use it properly. So they don't read body language efficiently when they're in close, tight crowds. That's another reason why they have problems, okay? So we decided to test with a neurotracker, which is totally, seemingly irrelevant task. Train them on that and see whether it's going to help them with this task, which is also a dynamic task, biological motion. That's also published, and this is work from one of my PhD students. Well, she just finished or graduated last year, Isabel. And we did a series of projects, and this is one of them. So we took now three older groups, same age, okay? And we trained one of them on the neurotracker, and we tested them at 16 meters and 4 meters on the biological perception. So this is coherent, so this is the amount of noise they can tolerate in the image. We're just changing the phase of these movements with noise targets, okay? And what you see is that the group that was trained, they're very well identical, whether it's 16 meters or 4 meters, so it looks like they don't have this drop. But these other two groups, one of them was a control group, so not trained, and the other one, we trained for exactly the same amount of sessions on a vision task in exactly the same amount of environment with exactly the same experimenter. So maybe it's something magic about my student, Isabel. No. We had her do the same thing, but it was a spatial discrimination task. Okay? That's all they did. Same amount of time, same exposure. No transfer whatsoever. So the neurotracker group somehow developed all the right mechanisms to regain this 4-meter deficit that we would expect for this group. So that's an example of transfer. And now we have 2 funded projects by the driving authority in our government to look at aging drivers that have accidents. So they send us drivers that have accidents in the last year. And we first assess them, and then we test them on driving, and we see their improvements on other abilities. And this is something we also want to do here with different specialized drivers, because we have some very specialized drivers here, like the delivery people, or the truck drivers, or bus drivers. Yeah, the special mental ability. And we're going to really see whether that's the case, or whether it's different. So let's go back to the fundamental properties of attention. You know, as a teacher, I want to make sure that you have certain concepts that you're taking home. Why is this working? Why did it transfer from one task that was seemingly irrelevant to the other? Because the way the neurotracker is set up, it really solicits certain mechanisms. And most of them are related to attention. Okay? Well, the first thing, if you think about the task, there's selective attention. You have to select the elements. Well, that's already, some people will have problems with that initial selection. And then it doesn't stop there, because you're selecting, you keep your selection, while there are other relatively irrelevant movements, like 2 other balls that you're not tracking and bouncing against each other. That attracts your attention too, but you have to avoid that and stay focused, you know, and stay selective. So selective attention is very much solicited. You have distributed attention, that's pretty obvious, especially when you have more than one target. You have to distribute your attention focus to different areas. Then you have the dynamic component. Attending something that's moving is not the same as attending to static or attend to this area, that area, or even switching. Attention switching is one thing, but attention tracking is a different component. And excuse me, maybe the most important one, sustained attention. Because remember, we're always probing you in that limit. And that limit lasts for a number of seconds, and you have to stay concentrated. So how many of you, when I showed you the examples, and the fast speed, you would, I hear, in the middle. That's because you lost it. You lost it there. So you can do it for a while, but then shoot, too much. And that's just, if we put you in the right spot, that's what you build. That transfers over. And now we do stuff with attention deficits now. We've had trials in 3 school boards in the States. These were our preliminary data we did with a neuropsychology clinic. Now, notice this curve is nothing like the other curves that I showed you before. It's flat, and then goes up. Why is it flat? Because these are attention deficit children. It's flat. Their brain is not the same. And, however, when we train them on this thing, and then we test them on standard tests like AVI plus CBT, it's called a continuous performance test. This is much like school things, numbers that come on, you have to stay, and then every once in a while the number is different, you have to say it's different, and so on. These are standardized tests used in attention deficits. What we found is pre-post training with a neurotracker that in fact we're getting significant benefits. Now this is ongoing, it's still early, but we're very encouraged by this. And what I really want to iterate is this. What's more important is not, again, I'm always going to take you away from the absolute values. What I'm interested in is the growth, how the brain is plastic. And I just here, those values relative to here is not relevant. I just took the normal curve that I have for the usual growth, and I did it, normalized it, so that you can see the shape is different. Initially, when we learn this, if our brain is okay, we learn this quite fast at the beginning, and then we level up. But what happens when you have attention deficit? It looks like you're slow going. Your networks here take a while to build, but then you do have a build up, and that's the key. This transition is what you're looking for. And by the way, we're doing a lot of concussion work in sports, you can imagine. And this is exactly the kind of profile we see if somebody's been concussed, okay? And is still under the chronic influence of concussion. What we find is that it takes a while for them to actually build those specialized networks. Now, it doesn't mean there's not something going on. It's just that it's not expressed functionally. And it takes a certain while before that you reach the threshold where you can actually use it well. Okay, so you can build over it. So now we're looking at using that as like a therapeutic approach. So I'm almost finished. I know I'm over the time, but this is just, I wanted to leave you with these basic principles. Now there's a lot of things that we think looks like a relatively simple task, but if it's used the right way, with the right combinations, and you can see that the flexibility of it is almost limitless, really, because you can change the number of items, you can change the number of everything, is manageable. And in fact, now what we have is we've just developed what we call a signature program. So initially, it plays with certain parameters in a very short time, and sort of profiles you, and then builds a training program that's optimized for where your deficiencies are compared to others. Okay, that's we think it's going to be very useful for the populations. And in fact, this is sort of like a demand that comes from the users. The people that work with different populations, they say, well, this is way too high. You're working with the sports version and this and that. So we have an adaptive process. And of course, I have to thank, first of all the people in my lab, because they do the work. I'm the one who presents it. But really, people testing and going through the process and so on. The Cognizance, the whole team of Cognizance, because they really support me in the research. And of course they know, because if they don't, I leave. So that usually helps. But I also want to thank all the agencies here, the government, the Canadian government has been very, very supportive of all their efforts. The Canadian Institute of Health, the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council, the Quebec version of the Quebec government, and of course the driving agency, driving authority of the government that's funding a lot of the projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very sophisticated and mind-blowing presentation. Okay. Now we are open for question and comment. Yes.
Nice special lecture today, Professor from I'm Prachya from College of Research Methodology and Cognitive Science. I have one question to ask Professor. From the beginning of the lecture, crowd movement dynamic is the original idea for your research. And I wonder about how to apply your original idea into theoretical framework and shift into physical training in sport. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think I'm going to break your question down and make sure I understand what you're asking me here. So you're asking me how you start from an idea, from a concept, and how you sort of build theory or build theoretical notions from that concept. I think the key to that is in the intention framework. You saw in the intention framework. So the question is, we still have a lot of questions. We still don't know what attention is. It's a very large context, and it's being refined as we move along, as we've seen. And we're finding it's not one big thing. We used to think of attention as in the Posner kind of approach, where you have one, center of attention, which is a fantastic word, and it says, well, you have a zone, and you can play with that zone. And, it started simple like that, but clearly that's not the case. There's all sorts of circuits, that are involved. So I think from a theoretical framework, we have lots of elements that we play with. And in fact, when we're talking about what is it that we're actually soliciting, when we do an initial assessment, which I mentioned in the last part, this is what we're looking at now. So if we want to sort of test the sustained component, what we do now is we start playing with that time that you have to do the retention, for instance. That's really like a short sustain. And then there's that immediate component, and then we have sustained it over time, which is more like attention endurance. Do we assess that? You see, these are the kinds of theoretical framework that we're sort of building, because we're all talking about, and then of course, so that's from a cognitive science theoretical framework, but then you have from the neuroscience framework, which are not the sociable, but from the neuroscience framework, it's the plasticity issue. So what we have now, just before I left, I found that I got another grant from the Parkinson's Society, and we're going to be doing imaging pre and post. So we're doing functional MRI, we're going to be looking at circuits, building the circuits, what are those networks that are being built, how specialized they are, and what's happening to them. I mean, when you have a specialized network, you really, what really happens there in that context is you think you're using less and less neural structure to do the same thing, really, because what you're homing into what's essential, right? If you think about aging, it's exactly the other thing that happens usually. So if you look at you do some task and in aging, the people do functionally the same level. And we've shown that, for instance, for some spatial judgments. But from a brain perspective, not the same. They're soliciting extra networks. And this is based on some of the theories that I proposed in 2002 about aging, was saying, well, really, the complexity component of the neural network is really critical. Why? Because that's going to show as behavioral expression or not. Because even at the simple tasks, the brain's working differently, but we can't measure it. Because they have what we call resources, extra resources they can access. They can use other networks. They can solicit larger networks, but it won't have a consequence behavior. As soon as you complexify the task just a bit, as you saw from an energy attribute to a second order attribute, all of a sudden you're soliciting a little more brain function, and then they start dropping down. And that was the basis of all the work that we've been doing, and certainly true from the neurotrainer. So you see, from a cognitive science framework, theoretical framework, from a neuroscience, neuroplasticity theoretical framework, we can do that. Now, the second part of your question had to do with motor ability. Is that it? Yes, okay. So if the motor ability is, again, it's not the social. You saw, we've had people standing up. So what is it that is really shared here? That's a nice question. And how is it, whether it's shared the same way when you're dealing with experts, like pro athletes, the fact that it was even shared in that context surprised me. So my own data surprised me, which is a good thing, I guess. But, and then it leads us to other questions. And we saw when we started implementing, well, what happens then? If we're sharing these mechanisms, then if we solidify them, can we build more efficiently on them? And so, again, it leads us to more better theoretical notions of what's going on, a better understanding of what the brain's doing, how it's putting it together. And the fact that it's still plastic, these are not hardwired components. Hardwired components, I'm sorry, that's component. So, and all this theoretical framework, this understanding of how the brain works, how the brain puts, your perception, your cognition, your motor actions, your actions, that helps us then come back to a better system to help, to transfer over. Because if we have that understanding, then we sort of have a better sense of how we can isolate the training programs, adapt them to the right populations, work on the right things. But I want to be clear about one thing. This is always an ongoing process. What is true today won't necessarily be true tomorrow, and thank God, because I'm out of a job if it's quite hard. So it's an ongoing process. And in fact, what's really beautiful about this is that more information we're getting now from the use and from the structure and with the research and experiments, the better the system is going to be over time. It's going to refine itself. And the use list with the stuff that is not useful is going to go away, hopefully, and the stuff that is more useful is going to be better emphasized. And it's an ongoing process. But thank you for your question. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Long-winded.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry, it's a pity that we have limited time. So I think we have time for only one more question, please. Yes, that gentleman, please.
Thank you for having us the special issue right here. Just one quick question. As a fundamental of the neuro tracker, and for what I learned through this lecture, I mean the attention is very important to us.
Attention? Yes.
Yeah, that's why I would like to know how can we practice in mentally and physically to be a good attention, something like that.
Use a neuro tracker. That's exactly the point. You see,
just kind of simple.
No, but well, I was semi-joking. I would say the neuro tracker definitely, because that's what we're seeing that the improvement. It does that, and to extents that we never even expected, because it's, I don't know why exactly, but you see all the theoretical framework that we propose. Why we think this is happening, that is happening. That's the best we can do. But it really solicits all of this as dynamic. It's large. It's hitting large, and that's the advantage of the neuro tracker. The disadvantage is it's hitting large. So that means if I want to isolate a specific component, I have to find another way, right? Because this is soliciting all sorts of things at once. It has a better chance of transfer, but then, okay, so we break it down. And we do this, we have now elements where we're breaking it down. But there are other means, of course. One of the things that I'm interested in testing here also is people who meditate. Why? Because that's another form of training, isn't it? Okay, it's another form of mental training. Now, there's still debates. How much is that training, your ability for concentration, and so on. These are not dissociable from attention either. So you've got a group here that people who go internal to train their mental abilities, and then you have people who go external, like our pro players. It's exactly the other way around. They're all action. There's no introspection. In fact, they get criticized often because they say stupid things sometimes. These are very smart people. They're misjudged. They're misjudged because they don't use their brain to discuss, sort of concern about things of life necessarily. They use their brain who have a very sophisticated ability of processing something that's very complex and getting action on the spot. So that's why, but we can't just say they're stupid, that's wrong. So there are many ways. So I would say, well, any technique that helps you improve your concentration, your focus will help. There are other techniques, for instance, we have, I know it's long, and I know we're over time. I want to finish this one thing, okay? We are now doing I have another student right now, we're looking at neurofeedback combined with a neurotracker. And neurofeedback is another technique that has been proposed. But typically neurofeedback is long. It's a long process. Why? Because it's not natural to have an internal representation to train attention and focus and stuff like that. So the way you do with neurofeedback is you measure brain activity. You represent that graphically or something. By sound or by graphics, and they say, I'm not in the alpha range, I'm in the, different frequency bands, and they learn to use that to sort of try to control internally, difficult to do with meditation. So what we've done is we've combined that technique with NeuroTracker, which is a lot faster with the attention vector children than neurofeedback. And what we found is that they boost each other. In other words, see, so there's now a technique where we have both neurofeedback with the NeuroTracker, and we make them look a little more like pros. So there are many ways, but NeuroTracker is a good one.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the lecture is very interesting. Maybe next semester we will invite the professor to come for one semester, and then you can talk to him. Okay. So. Okay. Thank you very much. And the conversation will start.
Alexis Tocqueville also urges for political association for attaining public goods.
First, personal personality factors. The heavy user of the internet are somewhat younger and growing up in the age of technology and taking advantage of it. Generally,
look at this one for the risk, the partial awareness is not so high. Like in the we look at the switching position here, we can the session that we studied. That means in this case the
presentation. First, introducing myself. My name is Pichera Sambun. I'm from Kimbrook University of Technology, Thonburi. Fungi, cellular Burapha extract with antifungal activity of eukaryotes, which cause and doesn't cause disease. The ability of pathogenic fungi can be found in humans.
Of research tool, data collection, data analysis, community leader, health officer, and volunteer from general public. Was developed to collect information from entire population of the elderly. Risk factor in their home.
It is presented together at the study phase and recombined is
the title is a causal relationship model of alcoholic drinking behavior for undergraduate lab people.